The first time Micah Roas heard her voice, it wasn't human. It was a broken thing, a strangled sound, scraped from a throat that had forgotten how to make words. It rose up through the cottonwoods like a ghost's last breath and hit his ears with the force of a memory he couldn't place. He crouched low, rifle ready, his back pressed against a limestone outcrop. Something was out there. Something wasn't right. He'd been tracking mule deer for 3 miles, trying to get meat back to his cabin before sundown. But this wasn't the sound of deer. This was the sound of pain. Raw, ragged, almost feral pain. He moved like a shadow, his boots barely kissing the soft soil. Every instinct he had, sharpened by 4 years of war and a lifetime in the wilderness, was screaming at him. The creek gurgled softly beside him, a silver thread cutting through the quiet valley. And just around the bend, he saw her. She was slumped against a fallen log, a mess of blood-stained calico and tangled hair. Her legs were curled up to her chest, her shoulders heaving like she'd just outrun hell itself. Where her skin wasn't smeared with dirt and grime, it was a road map of bruises, pale and purple and angry red. She was clutching her skirt in 2 tight fists, like it was the only thing holding her together. Micah kept his distance. He knew better than to approach a wounded animal, and right now, that's exactly what she looked like. "Miss!" he called out, his voice low but steady. Her head snapped up. Her eyes were blue but not the color of the sky. They were the color of ice, wide and wild and full of a terror that made the hair on Micah's arms stand up. "Don't come closer," she rasped, her voice like gravel. "I swear to God I'll bite you if I have to." Micah held his hands up, slow and deliberate. No rifle, no threat. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "You're bleeding." She laughed. It was a terrible sound, sharp and cracked and completely empty of humor. "So what?" she spat. "You gonna finish what the last man started?" Micah didn't flinch. He'd heard that kind of laugh before, in the med tents on the battlefield, in the smoking ruins of burned-out towns. It wasn't a laugh. It was a shield. "I'm not that kind of man," he said, his voice even. "Sure you're not?" she shot back, her own voice dropping into something hollow and dead. "If you're going to kill me, do it fast. Just don't look at me." Those words cut Micah deeper than any blade. There was a story in that sentence, a story he didn't want to know but knew he had to hear. He took a single cautious step forward. "What's your name?" She didn't answer, just stared at him with those haunted eyes. "Mine's Micah Roas." Still, she said nothing. He crouched down slowly, the way you would with a spooked horse. "You're hurt bad," he said, nodding toward her shoulder. "If that wound gets infected, it'll take your arm. Maybe worse. I've got clean water, bandages. Let me help." Her fingers, still clenched in the fabric of her skirt, trembled. He could see the blood now, a dark stain that had soaked through the right shoulder of her dress. The fabric was torn, ripped jagged by a bullet, or maybe a run-in with barbed wire. She just watched him, her eyes searching his face, trying to read his soul, trying to figure out if he was just another monster wearing a different mask. "I ain't gonna touch nothing you don't want touched," Micah added, his voice soft. "But I've seen infection take good men quicker than a bullet. Let me just clean it. Then I'll be gone." The seconds stretched into minutes. The wind whispered through the trees. A hawk screamed somewhere high above them. Then finally she gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. Micah moved forward and knelt beside her. He unhooked his canteen, dipped it in the cold creek water, and pulled a clean cloth from his saddlebag. "This is gonna sting," he warned. She didn't so much as flinch when he dabbed at the wound, but he saw her lip tremble just for a second. "You got lucky," he said, his voice low as he worked. "Bullet grazed you, deep enough to bleed like hell, but not deep enough to stay." "Yeah," she muttered, her voice dripping with bitterness. "Lucky, that's what they call me." Micah didn't say anything. He just kept cleaning the wound. As he worked, he saw the other marks, older bruises fading to yellow and green on her arms, finger marks, a split lip that was just starting to heal, and then, as the blood-stained calico slipped just a little too far down her leg, he saw it. Burned into the skin of her left thigh, neat and precise and deliberate, was a single word. Property. Micah's hand froze. Her eyes followed his gaze, and a sound that was half a sob, half a growl escaped her throat. She yanked her skirt back down, her movements frantic. "Now you know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Now you'll turn me in, just like the rest of 'em." Micah sat back on his heels, the word echoing in his head like a gunshot. Property, branded like a head of cattle. In 4 years of war, Micah had seen every kind of cruelty imaginable. He'd seen men do things to other men that defied description. But this wasn't the chaos of war. This was something else. This was systematic, controlled. This was a kind of evil that wore a calm face and carried a ledger. "I see what they did to you," he said quietly, his voice rough with an anger he hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't see who you are." And that was the moment she finally broke. Her shoulders started to shake, and silent tears carved clean tracks down her dirt-caked cheeks. She covered her face with her hands, ashamed to be crying in front of this stranger. This man who had seen the one thing she'd been trying to hide from the world. "I ran," she said, her voice muffled by her hands. "From a place called La Mara. They called it a recovery station. Said I owed a debt after my mother passed. But it wasn't a station. It was a stockyard for women." Micah's stomach twisted into a knot. "How'd you get out?" "Fire," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Some dumb guard left a lantern too close to a hay bale. I ran while it burned." Micah stood up and offered her his hand. She flinched, her whole body recoiling, but she didn't pull away completely. "You can stop running now," he said. "I've got a cabin about 2 miles upriver. It ain't much, but it's dry, and the door locks from the inside." She stared at his hand like it was a snake, a trap waiting to spring. "They don't let their property go," she whispered, the word tasting like poison in her mouth. "They'll come for me." Micah's voice didn't rise, but it landed with the weight of iron. "Then let 'em come. They'll find me first." Something flickered in her eyes. It wasn't trust, not yet. It was too soon for trust. But maybe it was the echo of it, the ghost of a feeling she thought she'd lost for good. She took his hand. Her own was small and cold in his. They walked in silence, Micah matching his pace to her slow, stubborn limp. Her jaw was set, her face a mask of pain, but she didn't complain once. They reached his cabin, a small, sturdy structure tucked deep in a canyon between 2 cedar ridges. She stood in the doorway for a long time, just looking. She scanned the small clearing, the vegetable patch, the corral with his one old horse, the rain barrel. Micah saw her take a long, deep breath, like it was the first time in days, maybe weeks, that she didn't expect to be chased. "It's peaceful," she murmured. It was the highest compliment she could have given the place. Inside, she sank into a chair by the cold fireplace while Micah boiled some water. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice flat. He stirred the flames, bringing them to life. "Maybe I'm just tired of being alone," he said, not looking at her. She blinked, surprised. "Maybe," he added, finally meeting her gaze, "you are too." That night, she didn't sleep. She just stared into the fire, a wool blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, while Micah lay on his cot nearby, pretending to be asleep. She thought about the brand, the smell of smoke, the sound of women screaming. The fear hadn't left her bones, but something else was there now, too. something small and fragile. In the dark, she whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. "Micah, you still think I'm a person?" He didn't answer right away, but she saw his silhouette nod, slow and sure, and for now, that was enough. Alma Tucker hadn't slept in what felt like a lifetime. She'd close her eyes and the shadows would close in around her, the flickering firelight of the cabin turning into the torchlight of the camp. The quiet crackle of the logs would become the sound of screams tangled in smoke. The warmth on her skin would turn into the searing sting of the branding iron. The hard ground beneath her knees as the guards laughed and called her stock. Here in Micah's cabin, the silence was almost worse. It was too quiet, too still. It gave her mind too much room to fill in the gaps with memories she had spent months trying to outrun. She sat curled in a wool blanket, staring at the flames. Micah was across the room, leaned back in his chair, his hat pulled low over his face. He'd done the same thing every night since he brought her here, giving her space, giving her silence, letting her find her way back to herself, assuming that self even existed anymore. Tonight, her voice cut through the stillness like a shard of glass. "Micah, you still think I'm a person?" A long moment passed. Then his head tilted just enough for her to see the line of his jaw in the firelight. "I think the people who did that to you," he said, his voice a low rumble, "don't know what that word even means." Alma swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry, scraped raw by all the words she hadn't said yet. She pulled the blanket tighter, the rough wool a small comfort. She looked down at the scar hidden beneath the fabric, the one that proved she had belonged to someone else, the one that screamed she was less than human. "They didn't just brand my skin, Micah," she whispered. "They branded my name right off me." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and poured her a tin cup of warm water from the kettle hanging over the fire. No words, just a quiet offering. She took it with both hands, cradling it like it was something precious that might shatter at any moment. "I used to be Alma Tucker," she said, her voice gaining a little strength. "My daddy was a horse trainer. We had a little farm outside Los Lunas. I could ride before I could properly walk. Knew how to fix a fence by the time I was 6. Mama taught me how to salt meat for the winter and how to shoot a possum at 50 feet. She let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a bitter sound. "Look at me now." Micah just listened, his face unreadable in the shifting light. She took a sip of the warm water. "After Mama and Papa died of the fever, the bank came calling, said we owed, said if I just signed some papers, they'd restructure the debt, make it manageable. I was naive. I was grieving. I signed." Her voice cracked. "Next thing I know, I'm in the back of a wagon with a chain on my ankle heading to a place called Lamara." She looked at him, her eyes blazing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "They told me I was leased labor, under something called the Recovery and Reform Act. Said I'd work off the family debt. 10 years, they said. Maybe less, if I kept my head down and worked hard." He just listened, his jaw tightening, a quiet anger hardening his features. "But that place," Alma continued, her voice trembling with rage, "it wasn't about labor. It was a damn kennel, a stockyard. We weren't workers. We were things, breathing inventory." Micah set down the kettle, the metal clanging against the stone hearth. "I believe you," he said, and the simple words hit her with the force of a physical blow. "No one else did," she whispered. "Not the sheriff I tried to tell, not the circuit judge, not the church ladies who brought us thin soup once a month and never ever met our eyes." He nodded once, his expression grim. "Because believing you," he said, "would mean they'd have to do something about it." Alma blinked, startled by how true that felt. She stood up and walked over to the small, cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The person staring back at her didn't look like Alma Tucker. She saw hollow cheeks, a split lip that was healing badly, and hair that had been hacked short and uneven with Micah's hunting knife 2 nights ago. But still, it was the first time she'd seen her own face in weeks. "I don't think I can go back to being her," she said, her voice quiet. Micah crossed his arms over his chest. "Then don't," he said simply. She looked at his reflection in the mirror. "Be someone else," he continued. "Someone who survived. Someone they couldn't break." Alma turned around slowly. "You talk like I've got a choice." "You do," he said, his gaze steady. "You're not at Lamara anymore." She hesitated, her hand instinctively going to the brand on her thigh. "This brand says otherwise." Micah stepped closer, closing the distance between them until he was standing right in front of her. "I've seen a lot of scars, Alma, bullet wounds, knife marks, burns, but the worst ones aren't the ones that bleed. They're the ones that make you forget who you are." Her eyes welled up with tears again, and she hated herself for the weakness. But this time she didn't look away. She held his gaze. He gestured toward the door. "Come on. It's almost morning." She followed him outside into the cool, crisp dawn air. The mountains stretched out before them, their peaks painted pink and gold by the rising sun. Mist still clung to the ridge lines. For the first time in a long time, the world felt bigger than the cage she had just crawled out of. Micah led her to a stump near the woodpile and handed her a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. "Found this in the back of the barn," he said. "Figured you might want to pick your own fabric this time, something that ain't blood-stained." Inside was a simple bolt of blue calico. Alma touched it reverently, as if it might vanish into thin air. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." She nodded, a lump forming in her throat. "Thank you." They spent the morning in a comfortable silence. Alma cleaned the inside of the cabin, scrubbing away weeks of dust and neglect. Micah worked in his small garden plot, turning the soil. Neither of them said much, but something had shifted between them. It wasn't comfort, not exactly, not yet, but it was something close to it. Later that afternoon, as she was sitting by the fire, sewing a makeshift dress from the blue cloth, Alma heard them. Horses. Not Micah's old mare. He was still down by the stream, filling water barrels. These hooves were heavier, sloppier, the sound of riders who weren't familiar with the terrain. She peered out the small window. 3 of them. 2 white men and a wiry Mexican man with a long rifle slung across his back. The man in the lead wore a silver badge on his vest. It wasn't a lawman's star. It was a private recovery agent's medallion. Alma's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the fabric and crept over to the fireplace, grabbing Micah's spare revolver from the mantel. It felt heavy and cold in her hand. The men didn't knock. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, scanning the cabin, talking in low voices. One of them laughed and pointed at the smoke curling from the chimney. Alma backed away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. When Micah returned 5 minutes later, he found her crouched behind the table, the gun trembling in her grip. "They found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. His face darkened. He didn't ask her how she knew. He set down the water barrels, walked over to the window, and looked out calmly. "They ain't coming in today," he said after a moment. "Just scouting, making sure you're still alive." Her voice shook. "They'll be back." "Yeah," he said, his own voice grim. "They will." She lowered the gun, her hand slick with sweat. Micah picked it up. He showed her how to reload it, how to check the chamber, how to aim, how to breathe steady before you pull the trigger. "You're not going back," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement, a promise. Alma met his eyes. "I won't." Later that night, they sat by the fire again. The dress wasn't finished. The blue calico sat in her lap, the needle still threaded through the fabric. Her hands were moving slower now, but they were steadier. Micah finally broke the silence. "We'll need supplies. More ammo. Better boots for you." In town? She asked, her voice tight. San Viento. Alma's chest tightened at the thought. Crowds, stares, people who might know her, people who might talk. But then she looked down at the blue fabric in her hands. If I'm going to be someone else, she said, her voice firm, she'd better know how to walk through a town without flinching. He nodded once, a look of approval in his eyes. We'll ride at first light. She didn't sleep again that night, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of the dark. At dawn, Alma rode behind Micah on his horse, her new dress on, her hair tied back, her eyes wide open. Her hands trembled slightly, but her spine was straight as an arrow. They were heading into San Viento, a place where someone might remember her face, and where someone else wanted her dead. San Viento was the kind of town where the dust never really settled. It clung to your boots, to the wagon wheels, to the back of your throat when you talked for too long outside. The wind didn't howl here, it whispered, it gossiped. Every storefront had a pair of eyes watching from behind the curtains, and every set of boots that clomped along the boardwalk meant another name to remember or forget, depending on how much trouble they brought with them. Micah and Alma rode in just after noon. She wore the blue calico dress she had finished stitching by lantern light. It was rough and simple, but it was clean. Her hair was tied back tight, her chin held high, her eyes fixed forward. She looked like any other frontier girl until you looked too close, until you saw the shadows in her eyes. Micah felt her tense up behind him as their horse trotted past the blacksmith's shop. She hadn't said much all morning, not after the night they'd spent checking rifle rounds and sealing letters that might never be sent. She was holding herself together like a piece of glass kept warm by a fire, whole, but just barely. You still good? He asked, his voice low. I'm not good, she replied, her voice steady. But I'm going anyway. They hitched the horse near the mercantile and stepped up onto the boardwalk. San Viento was small, but it was busy. It was a crossroads town with a telegraph office, 3 saloons, and a church that only seemed to open its doors when someone died. The sheriff's office was closed. Of course it was. The bell on the mercantile door jingled as they stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust and wood smoke, mixed with the sweet scent of dried beans and molasses. A young boy, no older than 10, was stacking cans of peaches into a lopsided pyramid. He looked up as they entered, and froze, his eyes wide as he stared at Alma. She froze too. Then his mother's sharp voice barked from behind the counter. Don't just stand there gawking, Eli. Finish the stack. She looked up and offered Micah a warm smile. What can I get for you, Micah? Powder. 44 cartridges, some dried salt pork, and a bottle of calomel if you've got it. The woman winked at him. Still bleeding from your own poor stitching, are you? Something like that? While Micah talked to the shopkeeper, Alma wandered over to the bolts of cloth stacked by the window. Her fingers ran across the different fabrics, though she wasn't really looking at them. Micah saw her posture change, her shoulders tightening. Someone was watching her. Not him, not the shopkeeper. Someone else. From across the street, through the dusty pane of the saloon window, a pair of eyes was fixed on her. A man in a brown duster sat with his boots kicked up, a drink in his hand. But his stare wasn't casual. It was targeted. It was predatory. Micah leaned closer to the counter. Add a second pouch of powder to that order. The shopkeeper nodded, oblivious. Just then, the door creaked open again, and another figure stepped inside. Seamstress, Micah muttered under his breath. Alma turned. The woman was in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her face was composed, like porcelain that was about to crack. She wore a fitted blouse and a long skirt, the hem of which was coated in dust. She held a small basket filled with thread and scissors. She saw Alma, and she stopped dead in her tracks, her eyes narrowing. Alma stared back, her heart pounding. Micah watched the silent exchange, ready to step in, but the woman said nothing. She simply walked over to the cloth table and stood beside Alma. Then, without looking at her, she said, "You sewed that blue calico yourself?" Alma hesitated. "Yes. I need to hem the sleeves, though. They're a little long. I haven't had the time." "No one ever does," the woman replied. Then, so softly that Alma almost didn't hear it, she added, "Number 37. Alma froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. The woman turned, her expression unchanged. She handed Alma a small, neatly folded linen handkerchief. It was white with a delicate blue trim. Then, without another word, she turned and left the store. Micah walked over to her. Alma was gripping the handkerchief so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "What was that?" he asked. She slowly opened the square of linen. Embroidered in the corner, barely visible, was a number. 37. She folded it back up, her hands trembling. "She knows," she whispered. Micah paid for their supplies, and they stepped back out onto the sun-drenched boardwalk. That's when the voice rang out from across the street. "Well, I'll be goddamned!" The man in the brown duster was standing now, his hat tilted back, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. He looked Alma up and down, his eyes lingering on her like she was a piece of livestock at an auction. "I knew I'd seen that pretty little brand somewhere before," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. Alma stiffened, her face draining of color. Micah stepped in front of her, his body angled to shield her. The man just chuckled. "Didn't know you could get that mark cut off and sewn into a calico dress. Hell, maybe I'll try that next time I see Mr. Sutter. Tell him his favorite girl is walking around free as a bird." Alma's hand twitched, moving toward the revolver hidden in the folds of her dress, but Micah's voice cut through the tension, low and sharp. "Keep walking, Alma." The man ignored him. "She's a runner, you know," he called out to the gathering crowd. "One of Sutter's. Slipped out during that fire a few weeks back. Ain't even paid off half her debt. I'd wager there's a reward out for her by now." Micah didn't say another word. He walked straight across the dusty street, calm as a summer morning, and punched the man square in the jaw. The man stumbled backward, hitting the saloon door with a thud before slumping to the ground. He reached for the pistol on his hip, but Micah's boot was already on his hand, pinning it to the boardwalk. "You draw that gun," Micah said, his voice dangerously quiet, "and I'll break your wrist. You speak her name again, and I'll break your teeth." The man grunted, still grinning through the blood that was now trickling from his mouth. "She's marked, Roas. You can't unbrand a cow." Micah crouched down, his face just inches from the man's. "She's not yours," he said, his voice laced with steel. "She never was." Then he stood up and walked back to Alma, who hadn't moved an inch. People were watching now, their faces a mixture of curiosity and fear. But no one spoke. Not in San Viento. Not unless they wanted to find themselves in the middle of trouble. "Let's go," Micah said. They mounted their horse and rode out of town, the silence between them thick with heat and shame, and a rage that was slowly cooling into a cold, hard resolve. They didn't speak again until they were a mile out of town. Alma's voice came first, small and shaky. "That man?" "He knew Sutter." Micah nodded, his eyes on the trail ahead. "More than likely he works for him." "How long do you think we have before word gets back?" "Too soon." She looked down at the handkerchief in her lap, the little square of linen from the seamstress, numbered 37. Micah glanced over at her. "You think she was one of them?" "I know she was." They rode the rest of the way back to the cabin in silence. As they neared the canyon, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Alma tucked the handkerchief into her boot and looked ahead, a newfound steel in her spine. "They're coming," she said. It wasn't a question. "We both know that." Micah nodded once. Then we get ready." That night, Micah sharpened his blades by the firelight while Alma loaded bullets, her hands no longer shaking. Far off in the shadows of the canyon, something moved. And they both knew that tomorrow they would need help. Help from a man who didn't owe them a thing, but who knew how to disappear better than anyone else alive. The trail to Nantan Bay's place wasn't on any map. It was a scar carved through rock and scrub brush, sharp and nearly invisible unless you already knew where to look. Micah had only been there twice before, both times during raging storms when finding shelter was a matter of life and death. Alma didn't ask any questions when he told her they needed to ride out before dawn. She just packed the saddlebag and double-checked her rifle. They were 3 hours out from San Viento now, and every hoofbeat seemed to carry more weight than the last. The air was drier up here, thinner. Hawks circled on the thermals high above them, silent observers. The land didn't care who lived or died. It had watched generations of men bleed into its dust and had never so much as blinked. Alma rode in silence. She hadn't said more than a few words since their trip to San Viento. Micah gave her the space she needed. He'd learned a long time ago that you couldn't talk someone out of a wound like hers. You just had to make sure they didn't bleed out alone. By late afternoon, they reached the ridgeline. Tucked beneath a fold of red rock was a small adobe house, half swallowed by time and the encroaching wilderness. A thin curl of smoke rose from a narrow chimney. A rough-hewn crossbow hung on the door. There was no welcome sign, just a silent warning. Micah dismounted. "Stay with the horses," he said. Alma nodded, her eyes already scanning the brush around them. She had changed in the last 2 days. She was still shaken, but she was sharper now. Her fear had calcified into something quieter, a state of constant readiness. Micah approached the door and knocked twice, then paused, then knocked once more, a pattern he hoped was still familiar. A moment passed. Then a voice, raspy and dry as the desert floor, came from inside. "You brought the storm with you, Roas?" Micah allowed himself a faint smile. "Looks that way." The door creaked open. Nantan Bay stood there, barefoot and sun-browned, a coyote pelt slung over one shoulder and a long knife strapped to his thigh. His eyes were dark and calm, like a pool of water that never froze, no matter how cold the winter got. "You look worse than the last time I saw you," Nantan said by way of greeting. "And yet," Micah replied, "still better than I deserve." They embraced briefly, the way men who didn't need ceremony do. "Who's the girl?" Nantan asked, his gaze shifting to Alma. "She's not a girl," Micah said, "and she's the reason I'm here." Nantan peered past him. Alma stood beside the horse, the rifle resting comfortably against her hip. "She's got eyes like she's already buried something," he observed. "That'll make this easier." Inside, the small cabin smelled of mesquite smoke and bitter herbs. Strings of dried corn hung from the rafters. Jars filled with bones lined the shelves, mostly animal bones. Micah remembered one that wasn't. They sat at a small, rough table, and Nantan poured a liquid that tasted like mud and fire into 3 tin cups. "She escaped from a place called Lamara," Micah said, getting straight to the point. "You heard of it?" Nantan scoffed. "Lamara? I've heard the screams echo down the canyon on a dry night. It's Sutter's little pet project, hidden behind a wall of fake laws and paper judges. Every woman there signs her own sentence, and not a single one of them knew what it really meant." Alma stepped into the room, her presence filling the small space. Nantan didn't flinch. "You have a name?" "Alma," she said. "No last name. Used to," she added, her voice flat. "It burned with the rest of me." Nantan nodded once, as if that explained everything. "She's marked," Micah said, "and she's being hunted." "I figured as much," Nantan replied, taking a sip from his cup. "The only people who come to see me are the ones who are already being chased." He stood up and walked over to a shelf, pulling out a stack of old papers folded and tied with a leather strap. He tossed them onto the table. "Debt contracts," he said. "Found these off a dead trader last year. Some are signed with X's, some with full names. All of them are tied to Lamara." Alma leafed through them slowly, her hands trembling. "That one," she said, her finger pointing to a name. "Maribel Lawyer." "The seamstress?" Micah asked. "She was number 37, Alma confirmed. Micah's jaw tightened. The woman had slipped the numbered handkerchief to Alma back in San Viento. She was still there. "She's waiting," Alma said, a new understanding dawning in her eyes. "Just like I was, just like they all are." Nantan watched her closely. "You want justice?" "No," she said, her voice like flint. "I want them to be afraid for once." Nantan grinned, a rare sight. "Now you're talking my language." He dug out a map, crude and half-torn. "Lamara is here," he said, pointing to a spot nestled between two ridges, backed by a dried-up riverbed. "Only 2 roads in, 1 guard tower. They rotate their staff every 5 days. That's when they're most exposed." "When's the next change?" Micah asked. 2 nights from now." "Can we make it?" Alma asked, her eyes fixed on Micah. He looked at her, a silent question in his gaze. "We'll need to move light." "I'm not asking you to fight for me," she said, her voice unwavering. "But I am going in." "You'll need a mask," Nantan said. "They know your face now." She shook her head. "They branded me. Let them see the face of the woman who burned back." Nantan let out a low chuckle. "You've got teeth, Alma." She met his gaze, her own eyes hard as stone. "They took everything else. Teeth are all I've got left." Later that night, after the fire had burned down to glowing embers, Alma stood outside, her arms folded against the cold desert wind. Micah came and stood beside her, his shoulders tense. "You think this is suicide?" she asked, not looking at him. "I think it's something else," he replied. "I think it's freedom, just wearing different clothes." "You afraid?" "Yeah," he admitted, his voice rough. "I've seen too many good people get buried before they got to see anything close to justice." She looked up at the vast, star-filled sky. "Then let's make damn sure we're not next." Behind them, in the doorway of the cabin, Nantan loaded his crossbow. "You want justice out here?" he said quietly. "Justice bled out at Antietam." Micah turned to look at him. "Then we fight for something else." "What's that?" "Vengeance," Alma said, her voice like smoke on stone. "And fire." 2 nights later, under a black moonless sky with their weapons strapped tight, they descended toward Lamara. Alma didn't tremble anymore. She whispered to herself as they rode, a mantra against the darkness. "You don't get to kill me. Not yet." The cabin door rattled against its frame just past midnight. Micah was already halfway to the window, shotgun in hand, when Alma sat bolt upright in her chair, the revolver clutched in her hand. One look at his face, and she knew this wasn't just paranoia anymore. This was it. They had come. 3 silhouettes moved through the clearing like wraiths. One crouched near the rain barrel. Another took cover behind a large pine tree, a long gun aimed at the cabin. The third stood out in the open, his arms loose and relaxed, confident. That was the one in charge. 3, maybe 4, Micah whispered, his eyes never leaving the figures outside. Alma nodded, her mouth a tight line. "You want me at the back door?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then handed her a box of cartridges. "If they break through, don't waste time with a warning, just shoot." She loaded the gun with a calmness that surprised even her. Her hands didn't shake, not this time. Outside, boots crunched on the gravel. The leader stepped closer to the cabin and called out, his voice smooth and oily. "We ain't looking for trouble, Roas. We're just looking for a little piece of merchandise that wandered off. You return her to us and we'll be on our way. No harm, no foul." Micah moved to the edge of the doorframe, the shotgun held low and ready. "The only merchandise I see out here is you, selling your soul cheap for a paycheck." The man let out a cold, practiced laugh. "You really want to die for some branded stray?" "Already have," Micah replied, and then it began. The first shot came from the rifleman near the pine tree. It missed its mark, burying itself in the log wall just inches from where Alma's head had been a moment before. She didn't flinch. She moved. Micah ducked and fired both barrels of the shotgun toward the tree line. One of the men dropped, a scream tearing through the night. The sound was quickly replaced by the crack of return fire. A window shattered, sending a shower of glass across the floor. Alma rolled toward the rear door, flung it open, and dove behind the chopping block outside. Another shot cracked past her ear, so close she could feel the heat. She spotted the man by the rain barrel. He was crouched low, cocky, taking his time to aim. She lined up the sights of the revolver just like Micah had taught her. Breathe in, hold, squeeze. The bullet caught him in the neck. He collapsed without a sound, like a puppet with its strings cut. Inside, Micah grunted in pain. One hand clutched his ribs, blood already darkening his shirt. Alma scrambled back into the cabin, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You're hit." "It's just a graze." "You're lying." "Yeah." Outside, the third man, the leader, had seen enough. He turned and ran into the trees, away from the gunfire and the chaos. There would be no hero's ending for him. Just survival. Alma stood in the wreckage of the cabin. There was glass everywhere. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder, and there was blood in the corners. She looked at Micah, who had slumped into a chair, his face pale, his body swaying. "I can't carry you," she whispered, her voice filled with a dawning horror. "You won't have to," he said, but his words were slurred. She tore a curtain into strips and wrapped his side tightly, tying it off with trembling fingers. Then she grabbed a water skin, the remaining ammo, and a loaf of dried bread. She threw a blanket over his shoulders, slung his arm around her neck, and dragged him out the back door. They moved into the trees, following the narrow trail Nantan had once shown Micah. The moon was high now, the stars silent witnesses to their desperate flight. Every step was a gamble. By dawn, they reached the shelter of a shallow cave carved into the rock face of the canyon. Alma collapsed beside him, her chest heaving. She checked the bandage. It was still bleeding, but slower now. Micah coughed, a racking sound that shook his whole body. "Should have stayed and fought." "We did," she said. He looked at her, his eyes glassy with fever. "Didn't think you'd kill that man." "I didn't think I would either." She stared at her own hands. They weren't trembling now. They felt numb, heavy, like they were made of stone. "I used to cry when I stepped on a spider," she said quietly. "Now I bury bodies with a shovel and don't even blink." Micah didn't say anything. She turned to him, her eyes fierce. "You don't get to die, Micah." "Not yet." He managed a weak smirk. "I'll put that on a badge." She moved to start a fire, just enough to generate some heat, to keep the fever from taking him completely. As she struck a piece of flint against steel, something shifted inside her chest. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't fear. It was a cold, hard clarity. The men who had come for them, they weren't going to stop. Sutter wouldn't stop. Not until she was back in chains or buried 6 feet under, unless she stopped him first. Later, while Micah slept in fevered bursts, Alma ventured down the trail to find more water. That's when she heard the sound of hooves. She flattened herself behind a large rock, her heart pounding. A single rider appeared around the bend, a slim figure in a gray cloak with neat braids. It was Maribel, the seamstress. She dismounted with a practiced ease and knelt at the stream to fill a water skin. Alma watched her for a moment, uncertain, then stepped out from behind the rock. Maribel didn't jump. She just smiled faintly. "I was wondering how long it would take me to find you." Alma stared at her, stunned. You followed us. I followed the smoke, Maribel corrected her. She rose to her feet. You made quite a mess back in San Viento. I didn't start it. No, Maribel said, her eyes twinkling. But you finished it. They walked back to the cave together. Maribel was carrying a satchel. Inside were herbs, clean dressings, and something wrapped in velvet. A small pearl-handled pistol. Micah's bad, Alma said. I've stitched up worse, Maribel replied. You get me some fire and boiled water and I'll keep him breathing. Alma did as she was told. She didn't ask any questions. She just moved. Hours later, Micah stirred from his fevered sleep. The first thing he saw was Maribel, calmly stitching up his side. He tried to sit up. Relax, she said without looking up from her work. You're ugly enough lying down. He chuckled weakly. Good to see you too, Maribel. When the fire was steady and Micah was sleeping again, Alma sat beside Maribel outside the cave. You were one of them, Alma said. It wasn't a question. At Lamara? I was number 37, Maribel replied softly. Just like I told you. Why didn't you run? Oh, I did, Maribel said, her voice dropping. But I came back. I've been helping the others get out, quietly, one at a time. That's all I could manage. Until now. Alma stared into the flames. You want to burn it down, Maribel said, her voice a whisper. The whole damn thing, Alma confirmed, her voice filled with a cold fury. I want them to see our faces when we do it. Maribel smiled, a fierce, determined smile. Good, she said. I've been waiting a long time for someone angry enough to make some noise. She pulled a folded map from her satchel. Lamara's not just a camp, she said, spreading the map out on the ground. It's a ledger, a trade route, a lie that's held together by silence. She looked at Alma, her eyes shining in the firelight. We kill it. We kill every man who ever looked at us and said we were less. Alma looked at the crude markings on the paper. This storm, Maribel whispered, her voice filled with a dangerous hope. It starts with us. Under a new moon, Alma, Maribel, and a barely standing Micah prepare to descend on Lamara. They will not knock. They will not ask. They will set fire to the lie, and in its ashes, they will leave a message for all to see. She's not yours. The wind shifted just before midnight, and Alma smelled it first. Smoke. Faint and bitter. Not the smell of a campfire. This was the smell of coal-burned wood, industrial and controlled. It drifted down from the ridge above them like a warning. Lamara. She was crouched behind a boulder, overlooking the compound nestled in the canyon below. The buildings were arranged in a tight, efficient sprawl. Long wooden barracks, flanked by watchtowers, all surrounded by a fence of split rail and barbed wire. A single lantern burned over the main gate. The rest of the compound was swallowed by darkness. Maribel lay prone beside her, peering through a small spyglass. Her voice was barely a whisper. Shift change, 1 minute late. Alma nodded. That guard in the west tower, he's sleeping. That's not sleep, said Micah, who was struggling to sit upright on the other side of the ridge. That's a drunk nap. See the bottle on his boot? He winced, his hand moving to his side. The wound was healing, but it was slow. The fever had broken, but he still looked like death halfway postponed. Alma glanced over at him. You should have stayed back. And miss this? He said with a weak grin. You'll need someone to watch your back while you're busy burning their world down. She didn't argue. They were out of time for arguments. Maribel handed her a folded piece of black cloth. Stitched into it with red thread was a single number. 17. Thought you might want to wear something familiar, Maribel said. Let them see the number before it all turns to ash. Alma ran her thumb over the rough fabric. The threads felt like fire under her skin. I was branded like cattle, she said quietly. But tonight, they're going to learn that cattle don't cry when the wolves come. They charge. She stood up. Micah reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. Don't lose yourself in the fire, Alma. She didn't answer. She just moved, silent and precise, down the rocky incline, her skirt hitched up, her boots striking only stone. Maribel followed close behind, and then Micah, limping slowly, brought up the rear. They circled the compound and came up behind the supply shed, where the fence was weakest. Nantan's gift, a pair of bolt cutters with their handles wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, made quick work of the wire. They slipped through one by one, crouching in the deep shadows of the barracks. The stink hit them first. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, piss-soaked hay, the smell of despair. Alma clenched her jaw. There was no hesitation now. They reached the east barrack first. Alma carefully cracked the door open. Inside, 4 women lay on thin wooden bunks, silent and still. One of them opened her eyes and bolted upright, her mouth open in a silent scream. Alma moved quickly, putting a gentle hand on her shoulder. I'm not here to hurt you. The woman blinked, her eyes wide with disbelief. I remember you. You were 17. Alma nodded. I got out. You came back? Yes, she said. We all did. The woman's lips trembled. They'll kill you. Not if we burn this place to the ground first. They moved fast, from barrack to barrack. Whispered warnings, quick hand signals. The women who were strong enough to move were told to follow. The ones who were too weak were left with stolen blades and makeshift torches and told to wait for the signal. A flame in the window. By the time the bell in the watchtower rang for the midnight roll call, 24 women stood in the shadow of the supply shed. Alma looked at them. Some were in rags, others barefoot. Most of them were branded. They called us property, she said, her voice clear and sharp, cutting through the night air. They said we were debt. They said we were the price our parents paid for daring to die. She raised her voice, letting the anger she had suppressed for so long finally surface. But we are not theirs, and tonight we burn the books. One of the women stepped forward, holding a rusted fire hook. How? Maribel pointed toward the small office building near the back of the compound, where the ledgers were kept. That's the heart, she said. The rest is just bones. Then we start with the heart, Alma declared. They moved as one, a silent, determined force. Alma, Maribel, and Micah led the charge. They burst through the front door of the main office just as a guard inside was reaching for his pistol. Alma shot him before he could even raise it. He dropped like a sack of grain. The room was lined with shelves, groaning under the weight of dusty ledgers and stacks of contracts, signatures, thumbprints, lives sold and stolen. Alma began yanking them down, piling them in the center of the floor. Maribel struck the first match. The fire caught quickly, the dry paper curling and blackening, the ink bleeding into ash. Alma watched it burn until the thick smoke forced them out of the building. And that's when the compound erupted. Alarms, shouts, gunfire. The tower guard, no longer drunk, was ringing the brass bell with a wild, panicked frenzy. Floodlights swept across the yard. Guards spilled out of their barracks like angry hornets. But the women were ready. Flames burst from 2 of the other barracks. Screams rose from 3 different directions. One woman stabbed a guard through the ribs with a broken broom handle. Another stole his rifle and turned it on his friend. This wasn't war. This was vengeance, righteous and ragged and long overdue. Alma ducked into the dining hall and found a stash of lantern oil. She splashed it across the curtains and wooden shelves, struck a match, and stepped back as the heat roared to life behind her. In the chaos, Micah found her again. "You need to go!" he shouted over the roar of the flames. "They're coming heavy from the south gate!" Alma grabbed his arm. "Where's Maribel?" Before he could answer, a scream cut through the noise. They turned just in time to see Maribel being wrestled to the ground by 2 guards near the stables. She was struggling, kicking and biting, one hand still clutching her small pistol. Alma didn't hesitate. She ran full tilt, tackling one of the men and driving her elbow into his face until he crumpled to the ground. The second guard raised a baton to strike her, but Micah shot him from 10 yards away. They pulled Maribel to her feet. Her lip was split, and her eyes were wild. "I'm fine," she spat, wiping the blood from her mouth. "Keep moving." Together, the three of them sprinted toward the outer wall. Behind them, Lamara was burning. Barracks were collapsing into themselves, sending showers of sparks into the night sky. The women were screaming, laughing, weeping. Some had already fled into the woods. Others had stayed behind, swinging stolen rifles, pouring oil on the remaining ledgers, slamming doors shut and locking the guards inside their own prison. Alma reached the fence and turned back one last time. The smoke was rising like a great black storm cloud. She whispered, "Now you see what we really are." Micah helped her over the fence, and then they vanished into the trees. By sunrise, Lamara was gone, but the territory wasn't silent. The company would send more men. Sutter would want blood. And Alma, she wasn't hiding anymore. She was hunting. 3 days after Lamara burned, the bounty posters went up. Weathered paper nailed to saloon doors, fence posts, and the walls of churches from San Viento all the way to Santa Rosa. They didn't even pretend to be about the law. There was just a reward, scrawled in thick blood-red ink. $500, dead or alive. No trial, no charges. Just a name, Alma Tucker. Property of the Sutter Holding Company. Armed, dangerous, and branded. Alma stood on the edge of a ghost town called Las Piedras, staring at one of the posters as it flapped in the wind. She didn't blink, didn't speak. She just stared. Micah stood beside her, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his coat pulled tight against the wind. His wound still hadn't fully healed. He knew this was a mistake, stopping here, out in the open. But Alma had insisted. "You said you wanted to send a message," he said finally. "This poster is the message. You lit a match, and the whole territory saw the fire." She ripped the poster off the post and crumpled it in her fist. "Then I want them to see more than just the flames." Behind them, Maribel waited with the horses. She looked thinner, paler. The last few nights on the run had been hard on her. Alma knew she was pushing them too far, too fast. But the longer they waited, the more time Sutter had to round up the women who had escaped, to drag them back into chains. Micah rubbed his jaw, his expression grim. "Sutter's got mercenaries combing the land. They're not just waiting for us to show ourselves. They're actively hunting us." "Then let them find me," Alma said, her voice quiet but firm. "I want them to know where I am." Maribel stepped forward. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Alma?" Alma turned to her, her eyes blazing with a fierce light. "I'm done hiding. I was branded because they thought I was something to be owned. They didn't ask me if I wanted to fight. They just assumed I'd never get the chance." Her eyes were like chips of ice now. "Now I get to choose what kind of monster they made." The plan was risky, brutal, and simple. They wouldn't run. They would lure Sutter's men in, and then they would gut the machine from the inside out. They rode east toward the river junction, a narrow pass between two ridges where the freight wagons always moved slow and the guards grew lazy. Alma had been there once, during a supply run for Lamara. It was where Sutter's company moved women between their various camps, quietly and discreetly. No witnesses. Micah scouted the area and found an old, dried-up irrigation trench, wide and deep enough to hide in. Alma and Maribel stacked rocks along the ridge, turning the natural landscape into a deadly trap. And then they waited. By the second night, their patience paid off. A wagon rolled into the pass just after dusk. There were 2 armed riders flanking it, a driver up front, and at least 4 girls locked in the back. Micah gave the signal. Alma tensed, her rifle ready. Maribel knelt beside her, her hand on a bundle of dynamite. The wind held its breath. And then, boom! The first blast tore through the rear guard, throwing the man from his horse. The second rider reached for his rifle, but Alma's shot punched through his shoulder. He screamed, dropped his weapon, and ran off into the darkness. Micah emerged from the trench, gunning down the driver before he could even shout a warning. The horses bucked and screamed, but the wagon stayed upright. Alma rushed to the back. The girls inside were young, too young. Their faces were streaked with dirt, their eyes wide with terror. "We're not with them," Alma said, her voice gentle. "You're safe now. You're free." One of the girls reached a trembling hand through the bars. "You were at Lamara." Alma nodded. "I burned Lamara." The girl began to cry, tears of relief and disbelief streaming down her face. They freed the girls, hid the wagon, and buried the bodies. It was messy. It was quiet. It was war. And it was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, Alma led one hit after another. They raided a payroll station in Santo Viejo, setting fire to the registry books, shooting the foreman in the leg, and leaving him with a note pinned to his shirt. "She's not yours." They ambushed a trail boss near Arroyo Creek, cutting the leather bonds off of 6 women and burning his wagon to cinders. They stormed a half-built labor camp outside of El Rito, freeing 10 captives and wiring dynamite to the main frame of the building. And each time, before they left, Alma carved a single number into a door or a wall. 17, a mark of defiance, a scar turned into a signature, and with every raid, with every fire, the bounty on her head rose, first to $1,000, then to $2,000. Then came the day someone new joined the hunt. His name was Silas Dawn. He was a former Pinkerton, now a hired gun, and he was known for dragging people in alive just so he could watch them hang. He was efficient, precise, and worse than that, he was personal. Micah returned from a scouting trip to town with the news. "He's asking questions in San Viento," he told Alma, his voice grave. "He's got your face etched into a piece of tin. He's asking about where you sleep, who you trust." Alma didn't hesitate. "We draw him out." Maribel stared at her, her eyes wide with fear. "You don't trap a man like Silas Dawn. He traps you." "That's fine," Alma said, her voice cold as ice. "Let him." That night, they sent a courier to San Viento with a message. "She's waiting. Come and see what kind of fire you've made." Then they rode deep into the Badlands, into a crag of rock and dust where the stars looked like knives hanging in the sky, and nothing lived unless it had claws. Alma knew dawn would come. Men like him always did. Not for the money, but because a woman had said no and had lived to ride away. They made camp in a narrow canyon with only one entrance. Micah and Maribel laid traps, tripwires, sharpened stakes hidden in the brush. Alma sat by the fire, polishing her revolver. Her voice broke the silence of the night. Every man who ever touched Lamara, everyone who profited from it, they all thought we'd be too afraid to rise up. She slid the bullets into the chamber, one by one, slow and deliberate. "But fear," she said, looking up at them, her eyes reflecting the flames, "is just a tax you pay before you burn the whole house down." By sunrise, Silas Dawn would arrive. He wouldn't be alone. The final reckoning was here, and Alma had to decide. Was this about revenge, or was it about redemption? And what, if anything, is left of a soul after the fire finally goes out? The sun rose hard and red over the Badlands, the kind of sunrise that didn't ask permission, just burned its way into the sky. It dried the blood from the rocks and dared anything that was still breathing to keep going. Alma stood at the edge of the canyon, her revolver at her hip, dust on her boots, the wind lifting the hem of her long coat. Behind her, Micah was crouched low beside the rock wall, his rifle steady. Maribel was higher up, hidden among the boulders, her hands twitching over the wires of the dynamite charges they had buried the night before. They had been waiting for hours, and then they heard them. Hooves. 6 riders came into view, led by a man who didn't need to announce himself. Silas Dawn looked like death dipped in silver. He wore a long coat, clean gloves, and a pale hat that was tilted forward just enough to hide the smug smile on his face. He dismounted slowly, like he was stepping off a stagecoach and into a Sunday sermon. "I was hoping you'd make this dramatic," he called out, his voice echoing through the canyon. Alma didn't move. "You looking to talk, Dawn, or to bleed?" He grinned. "I came to collect. You can walk out of here or I can drag you. Makes no difference to me." She tilted her head. "Funny. That's what Sutter said right before we lit his house on fire." His jaw twitched. "You're proud of that, are you?" "No," she said. "I'm done with pride. I'm here for the ones who are still in shackles." Dawn nodded to his men. "Surround the canyon." Alma raised her voice. "If they move, they won't leave." One of the men hesitated. The others didn't. Micah fired first, dropping one of the riders clean off his saddle. Maribel hit the wire. A blast shook the ridge, sending a shower of shale and fire into the path of another man. Chaos erupted. Gunfire echoed through the canyon. Dust flew like smoke from a battlefield. Micah ducked, reloaded, and fired again. Maribel screamed something from above, but her voice was lost in the roar. Alma walked forward, calm and deliberate, straight toward Dawn. He drew his pistol. She fired first. The bullet tore through his shoulder, spinning him around, but he didn't fall. He rushed her like a wild dog, tackling her to the ground. They rolled in the dust, a tangle of fists and knees, dirt in their mouths, blood in their teeth. He gripped her throat, his eyes wild. "You think you've changed anything?" he snarled. She gasped for air, spit in his face, and kneed him hard in the gut. He reeled back, and she scrambled to her feet. "I didn't come here to change things," she hissed. "I came here to end them." Her hand found her revolver. One shot. Silas Dawn slumped over, dead before he hit the dust. Silence descended on the canyon, just the wind and the sound of one of the horses panicking and running off toward the horizon. Micah limped over to her. "You all right?" Alma nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Are we done?" Maribel slid down the rocks, her hair wild, her face streaked with soot. "They're all down," she said, her voice filled with a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it." Alma stood there for a long time, staring at Dawn's body. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just breathed, because she could. A week later, the news had traveled faster than any horse. Lamara had burned, the women had escaped, the bounty hunter was dead, and Alma Tucker was still free. The story grew with each telling. Some said she rode with ghosts. Some said she had been shot 6 times and had still walked away. Others claimed she had vanished into the desert with a knife in her teeth and God on her shoulder. But the ones who knew better, they didn't talk much. They knew the truth was much simpler. Alma rode into San Viento just before dusk, clean and quiet. She left a small parcel on the steps of the church, wrapped in cloth and tied with twine. Inside was a ledger page from Lamara. Her contract. At the bottom, scrawled in thick red ink, was a single sentence. "No one owns her now." Then she vanished. Some say she went north, some say south. Some say she crossed the river and started a farm where no one asked any questions and no one ever raised a hand unless it was to help. But wherever she went, the brand faded. Not from her skin, some scars never really go away. But it faded from its meaning, because what had once meant owned now meant survived. And that was enough. Micah stayed behind. He helped build a home for the freed women out in the valley, near the charred remains of the old barracks. They named it Las Hijas, the Daughters. No one owned the land. No one claimed any titles. They just grew food, raised goats, learned how to shoot, and taught others how to run and fight and stay free. Maribel became a midwife and a storyteller. She embroidered numbers into quilts, into the sleeves of shirts, into the hems of dresses, not to hide them, but to honor them. Each stitch was a declaration. We are still here. In the end, this story was never really about revenge. It was about reclamation. It was about taking back what had been stolen. Not just freedom, but identity and voice and dignity. It was about survivors who refused to stay silent. It was about a fire that was used not for destruction, but for illumination. Because sometimes, to burn down the entire system, you don't need an army. You just need one woman to finally stand up and say, "You don't get to own me. Not anymore." If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next video.